Fantastic. Well, good to see you all this morning. We're in John chapter 1. If you got a Bible, brought a Bible, or you've got the digital version of it, John chapter 1, the Gospel of John. John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And then if you jump on over to verse 14, he says, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld His glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. There are many words, many ways we try to describe this thing called Christmas. The theological term is incarnation. That's there in verse 14, the Word made flesh. We see it a lot in our Christmas songs, especially hymns. Those with deep theology, not that some of the newer songs don't have deep theology, but we've all been raised up on the old traditional Christmas songs. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity, pleased as man with men to dwell. Jesus our Emmanuel, hark the herald angels. You know the song. When you read those words, it talks about this thing that John calls the incarnation here. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, theologian of days gone by, had a little couplet that he tried to use to describe this thing about Jesus coming, the birth and the life and all of that. He said, "He whom worlds could not enwrap, yonder lies in Mary's lap." I like that. Others have called this Christmas, this thing that we call Christmas, trying to describe it, the God-man, the baby older than time, the infinite infant. I like this one. Deity in a diaper. Heaven at our level, or heaven at eye level. And then as you heard last week, if you were here, Todd talked about the way in a manger. Bless you. But here in verse 14, he talks about the Word made flesh. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. But then the Word was made flesh, the incarnation. And John picks a very specific word for word. He had several words available that would have meant word. But he picks a very specific word for a very specific reason. That word is logos, L-O-G-O-S. We get logic from that word. But the reason he chose this word to describe the pre-incarnate Christ was because this was a word that described a concept that was understood in both Greek and Hebrew culture. Now back at this time, first century, New Testament time, Greek and Hebrew thought were what everybody thought. The Greek thought was secular, we might call it scientific, philosophical, intellectual. That pretty well encapsulated it. Hebrew thought, although it was intellectual and somewhat philosophical, it was more spiritual thought. So people who thought about things secularly, intellectually, academically, philosophically, and people who thought about things spiritually or eternally or theologically, both of those concepts had this word logos, this word for word. Now the Greeks, of course, philosophy, Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, for those of you who have been to college or maybe you've read some philosophy, Plato had a writing he called the Republic. And in Plato's Republic, he has an allegory called the cave. And Plato, in describing Greek thought about why things were like they were, would say that our reality is like living in a cave. It's dark. We know there are things in the cave, but we can't see things in the cave. So someone put a fire in the cave. And the fire lights the cave, but not a lot. It flickers. It flames. And we see shapes and we see shadows. We see things. We know there are things, but where do the things come from? And Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Greek thought at this time would say, behind the things that we see, that we feel, that we taste, that we touch, that we hear, that we know, behind the five senses which gives us a tangible connection to the things we see, there are thoughts. And those thoughts are logos. Something out there somewhere randomly comes together, and here we have it. But we can't really tell because we're in the cave right now. It's dark, it's dim. Every once in a while we get a flicker, we get a flash, we understand, and then darkness again. And so philosophers talk about why this and why that and why the other. And Greek thought said, oh, that's the logos. The logos is the uncaused cause of all things causable. And then Hebrew thought. The Hebrews would say, going back to the Old Testament scriptures, to the Greeks, the Hebrews would say, yes, there are things, and yes, there are thoughts behind the things. But behind the things, behind the thoughts, there's a thinker. But the problem is, you can't know him. And so they would call the thinker behind the thoughts, behind the things, the logos, the cause. They would say if there are things and the thoughts created the things, then there must be a thinker behind the thoughts that made the things. If there's a creation, there must be a creator. If there's a design, there must be a designer. But we can't know him. He's so totally other than us. And so going back to the Old Testament, this would first be demonstrated when Moses, Exodus, was walking along in the desert behind some sheep. And he said, the King James says, he turned aside to see a bush that was burning but was not consumed. And as he beheld this sight, a voice came out of the bush, Moses, Moses, take off your shoes. The place whereof you stand is holy ground. Remember that story? And Moses begins to have this conversation with a burning bush. And in the process, Moses says, what is your name? And God, speaking from the flame, from the burning bush, says, I am. Literally, it's the transitive verb to be, not Shakespeare's to be or not to be, but God's to be. He says, I am the self-existent one. I am the Almighty. I am. Now, the Hebrews took that concept and they capitalized it in the Old Testament. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord. Yahweh or Jehovah. We don't know just exactly how to write it or how to say it. Scholars call it the Tetragrammaton, 4 letters. Jewish tradition says that the only time that name was ever said out loud was on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went into the tabernacle, later the temple, into the Holy of Holies, carrying the blood to sprinkle on the mercy seat to make atonement for the entire nation on that one day of the year. Now, they had to bring lots of sacrifices. You read the book of Leviticus on that. They were individual sacrifices for individual sins and individual issues. But on that Day of Atonement, the entire nation would gather around the tabernacle in total silence. It's called the Days of Awe, waiting to see if Yahweh, the name, the I Am, would accept the sacrifice. And when the high priest went into that place, only after great cleansing and all types of religious rigor, would he say that name. So at this time, John chapter 1, the Greeks called it the Logos, the thoughts behind the things. The Hebrews called it the Logos, the thinker behind the thoughts behind the things. John says the things that yield to the thoughts, that yield to the thinker, his name is Jesus. He's the one. And John is going to take all the Greek thinkers and all their philosophizing and all the Hebrew thinkers and all their theologizing. And he's going to say, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. A word reveals the thought. A word reveals what's on your mind. And at a deeper level, a word reveals what's in your heart. That's the importance and the power of a word. So when God the Father said, I want to reveal my heart to people, the Word was made flesh. Jesus came to show us God's love, show us God's heart. Not a theory, not a thought, not a theology, although those things are important and have their place in discussion. But there's a time when you just need one word, and that's Jesus, the love of God who came. And that's what Christmas is all about. Jesus came to show us God's heart, God's love. Now, you may have noticed, and you may have missed it, but Allison and I weren't here last week. We were in Rising Sun, Indiana. That's where Allison went to school. That's where she grew up. And I'd never been there before. So last Sunday was our anniversary, and we planned a trip, and we drove over there together. She wanted to show me around. And we drove to Rising Sun, and we had the most wonderful time. Rising Sun is a river town. It's right, I think probably, although I can't verify this, I think it's probably called Rising Sun because it's the easternmost point in Indiana. If it's not the easternmost, it's close. If you ever look at the map of Indiana, it kind of wiggles and wobbles off there with the river before it falls into Kentucky. And it's right there. And we stayed in a inn that looks right there on the river. That's where our room was. Very nice. And she showed me around. We went to Rising Sun High School, home of the Shiners. Rising Sun Shiners. We drove by there on Friday night, and she said, what are all these cars around the high school? I said, there's a ball game. Oh, she said, yeah, it's basketball season. They don't have football at Rising Sun, but big basketball. So I got to see the high school where she graduated from and all that. We stopped at Jack's. Jack's is like a little diner, like a cafe, kind of like Dixie's, Jack's. And we both had a Big Jack. It's kind of like a Big Mac, but it's not. It's a Big Jack. And it was very good. And then we had a piece of coconut cream pie. That sort of pushed us over the edge. But hey, whatever. So we went to Jack's, and she showed me the downtown, and we looked at things. Showed me places where she'd lived. My. It was such a wonderful thing to see those places. And the look on her face, that we could share that together, was so beautiful, so wonderful. Little log house she lived in for a while, and the trailer park where she lived for a while. And then she took me to Grants Creek. That's where her daddy pastored the church for 25 years. The bridge was out, the road was washed out. We had to go way around to the detour and all that, but it was worth it because when we got there, the present pastor was there. And she got to go in and see the church and sit down and play the piano. It was great. It was wonderful. So much I could say. But at some point, through all these experiences, there was a lull. And we were sitting. And she asked me the question, well, what do you think? Well, I had to say something, didn't I? And she wasn't just interested in what was in my head. Intellectual, I could pull it up on Google. It says here, Rising Sun has a population of 2477, and it is this and that and the other thing. It was founded in so-and-so by such and such, and Admiral this and... No. When she said, what do you think? She wanted to know what was in my heart. And the words we speak reveal what's in our hearts. And when John says the Word was made flesh, God says, I want to show you what's in my heart. I want to show you how much I love you. I want to show you who I am. I want to show you how I live. And when you look at Jesus and you walk with Jesus and you talk with Jesus, you have the heartbeat of holy God. And the Greek said, the Logos out there somewhere, thoughts somewhere, coming together, making something. We see it, but we don't know what it is. And the Hebrew says, yeah, there's things and there's thoughts and there's a thinker, but nobody can know him. He's so holy. We're so sinful. He's so awesome. We're so terrible. God can't be known. John comes along and says, I love you. I'm God. I love you. I'm God. I love you. Would you love me back? Would you love me back? Would you love me back? John will go so far in John 3:16 to say God loved the world so much, he gave his only begotten Son. Whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. Christmas is all about Jesus coming and providing the gift that we all need so desperately. There's a country singer, I'll have to ask Bob Preeby's name, I can't remember right now, sung a song several years ago that said, he had the birthday, we got the gift. But you have to receive it. You have to receive it. Some people can go all the way through Christmas and it'd be like C.S. Lewis said in that Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Always winter, but never Christmas. Some people go all through the winter and never have Christmas because they don't receive Jesus from God's heart into their heart. I was reading a story from Russian history. I don't read a lot of Russian history, but it was interesting, so I read it. But before the Russian Revolution back in 1917, where the USSR started, back in the USSR, veiled Beatle reference for you old coots. There was a kingdom in Russia and a Tsar king, Nicholas. And the story was that a friend of Nicholas's, a childhood friend, they were grown up now, he was king, he was friend of the king, he asked for a favor from the king. Would you give my son a job in the kingdom, a position? And the king acquiesced. He said, sure, you're my friend. And he gave the young man a job in accounting, the treasury. And unfortunately, as the story goes, the young man had quite a weakness for money. And he began to siphon off little bits here and there. We would call it embezzlement today in our culture. He intended to put the money back, but one thing led to another, and he kept taking more, thinking eventually he would replace, and it finally got to the point he realized he could never, ever make it up. Distraught, discouraged, obsessed, distressed, he decided to take his own life. He wrote a letter explaining what he'd done, the amount that he'd taken, and then at the bottom of the page he wrote, "For what I have done, who could repay?" ? And then he was so fatigued and worried and stressed out, he laid the revolver on the table and fell asleep on the bed. He slept several hours. In the early morning hours before daylight, there was a knock on the door. He opened the door, and there was a bag, a leather bag. And he opened the bag, and it was full of money, gold. And he couldn't believe it. He took it out. He counted the money. It was the exact total of what he had taken, of what he owed the king. What had happened was, someone, of course, had run the paper trail. They found out the young man had been taking the money, and they went and told the king. But the king, in his mercy, had placed the money in the sack, told the servant to take the money to the young man's home, knock on the door, and leave it for the young man. And as he sat there in total silence, stunned by what had happened, he noticed in the bottom of the bag a slip of paper. And he pulled the slip of paper out of the bag, and there was one word on the paper, and the word was Nicholas. And as he looked at the slip of paper and at the king's name, his eyes crossed the suicide note. And at the bottom of the note was the question, "For what I have done, who could repay?" And he laid the name on top. Only Nicholas could repay. For not only did Nicholas have the money, the wherewithal, but ultimately Nicholas had been offended and sinned against. The one who could, did. That's a pale picture of what Christmas is all about. But our sins have offended an awesome, totally transcendent, holy and mighty God. There's no way we could ever pay the debt we owe. And yet God sending His Son, Jesus paying the penalty for our sin debt, makes forgiveness possible. That's Christmas, my beloved. That's what Christmas is all about. The word is forgiven. The word is forgiven. The word is forgiven. And that brings us to Jesus 2020. Inside your bulletin, you've got an insert. I want to say a thing or two about that before I have one concluding story. As we move into this time of preparation for the new year, as I've prayed about the future of our church and my desires to see us grow in faith, hope, and love, we may grow in number, we may grow in budget, we may grow in building, we may grow in other ways. But my desire is to see Oak Grove Baptist Church grow in faith, hope, and love. Those are the three eternal things the Bible tells us. Faith is simply believing God and obeying God. Hope is that thing that people need so much, the hope of heaven and the hope of forgiven sin. And then love, of course, the greatest of these is love. Love for God and love for one another. And then love for others outside the church and the family of God. And so this Jesus 2020 thing, we want to invite you if you choose to. No one will be coerced. No one will be compelled. No one will be commanded. It's totally your choice. As you can, to join us in a 1-year walk through the life of Jesus. We're going to do that in 2 ways. We'll have a Bible study, 9:30. Sometimes we call it Sunday school. And you see the details about that there. It's 52 weeks through the Gospel of Matthew. It'll be from 9:30 to 10:30 on Sunday mornings beginning in January. And you can sign up for that, and the cost of that is $20. That's less than 50 cents a week. Allison and I ate at the Mexican restaurant yesterday. It was $20.38. Met a wonderful young guy in there named Sebastian. Really sharp guy. Anyway, another story for another time. But if you're in another group, doing another study, that's fine. There will be other opportunities, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But the material, $20 for a whole year. Gospel of Matthew, presenting Jesus as the King. That's Matthew's main focus. The portrait of Jesus as a king. And we'd love to have you. Maybe you've never been in a Sunday school or a Bible study. Well, it's time to change that. You know, the Lord loves you, and He died to save you, But he didn't die just to leave you until you go to heaven. He wants you to become more and more like him. And I found that when you walk with Jesus and you study his life, he just changes us from the inside out. It's a beautiful thing. So that study is going to be available Sunday mornings beginning in January. And you see that on number 1. Then the second way we're wanting you to consider walking through the life of Jesus is our Sunday night and Wednesday night devotional discipleship. These are the life application study devotionals from the life of Jesus. This is 365 or 6 days. Each day you have a little reading, and it's like a devotional book. So instead of trying to read through the whole Bible this year, I'm all for that, we're asking you to consider just reading through the Gospels. That's only 4 books instead of 66. It may be a little easier for some of us. But this book will be the basis for our Sunday night and Wednesday night times after our meal. You know, we have a meal on Wednesday nights and then after the meal. And all you'll do is read every day a little bit in the book, and then we'll come together on Sunday nights and or Wednesday nights. Some people got to work on Sunday night or Wednesday night. You can catch either one. And wherever we are is where we'll be. I just opened this up to week 3, day 1. So whatever week 3, day 1 is in January, we'll talk about that. We'll look at the scriptures. Now, you don't have to have this book, and you don't have to have the material to be involved. You can just bring your Bible. If you're one of those kind of people, hey, I'm fine with that. I'm a Bible guy too. If you don't want to buy the book, you don't want to have the book, you can show up on Sunday night or Wednesday night and join the discussion. We'll open the scriptures. The scripture passages are in here. It's the New Living Translation, this one, that we'll be using. I'm a King James guy, but hey, I like all of them. That's just me. We got so many great Bibles, it's fantastic. Anybody that doesn't have one, you can find one. This would be $10 for the whole year. So if you participate in both the Sunday morning Bible study and the Sunday night or Wednesday night, or both, $30 for the entire year. We're using this to tether us. Some of us have been walking with God a while, some of us not so long. But we're using Jesus' life to kind of be the thread that everything goes through. And I would really like for you to pray about it. Now, a third thing we're going to do is what we're doing now. I'm going to preach through the life of Jesus. That doesn't cost anything. I'm good for nothing. But I'm going to be in January with the birth and all that, going through Easter and the resurrection, and then I'll come back and look at some parables and some miracles and some I am statements and stuff like that as we go through the year. But just preaching through the life of Christ and making application, focusing on Jesus. That's why it's called Jesus 2020. So that's the study aspect of it. There's a Sunday morning Bible study. There's a Sunday evening, Wednesday evening devotional time, discussion, mentoring one another, praying together, getting to know each other better, and deepening our relationship with God and each other. And the preaching time. And I'm thinking about maybe trying to do something on the internet, but I'm not there yet. I'm kind of internet dumb, you know what I mean? But you knew I was dumb, but I'm also internet dumb. But what I mean is on our Facebook page, maybe a weekly devotional thing or something like that for some of you people that like that sort of deal. Maybe not. I haven't made up my mind on that. I'm still prognosticating about it. But anyway, think about that. That's what that insert's about. That's the study aspect. Now there's also a serving, because if all you do is study, you get sort of dry. You get sort of dull. You get sort of flabby. Study is beefing up, and serving is working it out. So we need some balance in our walk with the Lord, else we'll be hopping on one foot or the other. So the study aspect, feeding yourself with the Word, growing with others in the Word, connecting, leads to a serving thing. And I won't read all that. You can read that. We're breaking up the general ministries into 2 categories, welcome and witness, word and worship. So if you're interested in any of those things under welcome and witness, that would sort of be everything that happens before and after this. Guys in the parking lot, security, ushering, all that stuff. Visitation, outreach. Somebody comes to the church, we go visit them. Hey, how'd you like your visit? What can we do? We'd like to get to know you better. That kind of thing. We'll be doing some training on that tonight, right over here in the fellowship hall. If you're interested in any of those things tonight, and if you're not, you can come anyway. You just want to see what's going on. Everybody's always welcome. Hope we can make that clear. It's not a private club or anything like that. It's for anybody that wants to serve the Lord. So welcome and witness. What do we do when somebody visits? And how do we connect them? And how do we greet them? And how do we welcome them, make them feel part, and all that sort of stuff? How do we share our faith with people? How do we walk with them? All that. We're going to do that tonight. And then next Sunday night, Word and Worship. That's kind of what goes on with the teaching, Bible studies, worship time, children's church, all that sort of stuff. And then you see that ETC in that long line. That's because I run out of things to say. I just went zzz on the computer. Whatever else, fill in the blank. So be praying about what you're going to do with, for Jesus in 2020. He is Lord of all, or He's not Lord at all, somebody said one time. Be praying about that. Now, this little slip out on the table is for your name, your mailing address, or names, phones. That's contact information. If you don't want to participate, then don't check in these boxes and don't put any money in the offering plate, $20 or $10. That's okay. You can still come to the studies. You can still come to it doesn't matter. And you don't have to fill it out today. We'll do this all month. So I'd like to get one of these from everybody, so we've got your current address, phone number, etc. If you want to write birthdays and stuff on the back or whatever else, write a note. That's up to you. But if you're going to be participating in the Sunday school Bible study, then you would just check that, and the $20 goes right in the offering plates on the honor system. Same with the devotional book. If you want to participate in the devotional study, $10 for that book, check that off, put that right in the offering plate. And if you want to participate and you just don't have the money, and that's okay. There have been times I wanted to do something and I didn't have the money. Come see me. We don't want anybody to not be able to participate. Now, here's one more thing. I know I'm rambling. I can ramble with the best of them. Be patient. Some couples like to share a book. Some couples want their own book. You know, he's got a book, she's got a book. That's up to you couples, however you want to do it. But each material is $20. Each book is $10. So if you double that up, well, you can do the math on that. I just want you to know that the burden of my heart for our church fellowship is to be studying the life of Christ and living it out together. Studying about Jesus and serving Jesus together. That's all I care about. I turned 60, you know. I don't care what you think about me anymore. I'm beyond that. Somebody said, you wouldn't care what people think about you if you knew how little they did. But I'm past the point of trying to impress people, trying to have a big church, whatever that is. I just want to see people who know God's heart. He sent us a word, I love you. And we return that word. Yeah, I love you too, Lord. So I commit to the church. I commit to God's people. I commit to His word. I commit to serving Him. I commit to yielding my life to Him, my time, my talents, my treasure. That's all I'm concerned about. Because soon and very soon, we're going to stand before Him. Anything you decide to do for Jesus now, you'll never regret later. Heard a story, and I'll close with this, about a couple. They had entered what we call the empty nest stage of life. The kids were gone, and each of them had a desire to visit Ireland. She got on a computer and even found out that they had some long-lost relatives, Ancestry.com and all that business. He wasn't impressed by that. But they scrimped and saved until they had enough money, and they were going to go to Ireland. They lived in Kansas City. They got on the plane. They flew to Boston, made the connecting flight, flew to Dublin, Ireland. Everything was fantastic until they tried to get their rent-a-car. When they got to the rent-a-car place, there had been a mix-up, and the only car available was a manual transmission, a stick shift. and neither one of them knew how to drive it. Now, let me just say this. New things are hard, but the older you get, the harder they are. And some of you resemble that remark. But he felt like, being the macho man he was, he could figure it out, so they kind of jerked and sputtered and got through the streets. They come up to a red light. So they geared down, the light turned red, he looked at it, turned green. He couldn't get it into gear. He looked in the mirror, nobody was behind him. It turned red again and turned green again. He tried the second time, looked in the mirror, there's a couple of cars behind him. He's starting to get kind of squeamish. She started giving him advice. He tried to ignore that advice as best as he could. It turned green again. He's still trying to get it in. 4 cycles. And he's still sitting there. Finally, he realizes there's a large shadow to his left. He looks out the window, and there's a big old Irish guy standing there. He rolls the window down, and the big old Irish guy says, "Was there a particular shade of green you were waiting for?" Said all that to say this. The light is green. God's light is green. Is there a particular shade you're waiting for? He loves you. He's calling you and me and us and we. And you're still sitting at the light waiting for a particular shade of green. You know it's green. You know you ought to accept Jesus or come to Jesus or walk with Jesus or serve Jesus. What are you waiting for? Now is the time. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He's calling you today to come, to accept Him by faith, to follow Him in baptism, to become part of this church, to come back to Him in repentance over sin, to yield your life and commit in a new way, in a new sense. This is the time, this is the day, this is the place.